In 1953, a failed attack in Cuba set off a conflict with the United States that still hasn't ended. In July of that year, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led a ragtag group of rebels with hunting rifles and stolen uniforms in a surprise attack on the heavily guarded Moncada barracks. It would become the first step toward him becoming the United States' most indestructible enemy. Castro would go on to defy 10 American presidents, reportedly survive 638 assassination attempts, and bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. But the legend of that July morning has outlived even Castro himself. In 2026, as Cuba reels from a U.S.-imposed fuel blockade, a new generation has taken up the battle cry. This is our Moncada. On March 10, 1952, Fidel Castro woke up to grim headlines. Former Cuban President General Fulgencio Batista had returned to power in a military coup. The country's fragile democracy was gone before most of its citizens had finished their morning coffees. For Castro, a nationalist, the news was particularly enraging. He knew that Batista had spent decades cultivating Washington's favor, and Washington had spent decades cultivating his. American companies controlled much of the island's industry and exports. U.S. military bases sat on Cuban soil. To Castro, Batista's return to power meant one thing above all else. That arrangement was going nowhere. His hopes of seeing Cuba take more control of its own affairs seemed bleaker than ever. But for the young lawyer, it was not just a national crisis. It was a personal one. He had been widely tipped to win a congressional seat in the upcoming elections, which had now been canceled. Castro believed his entire political future had been wiped out overnight. Determined to do something about it, he used his legal background to file a petition challenging Batista's regime, arguing that the coup had violated Cuba's 1940 constitution. But with the courts already firmly under Batista's control, they refused to act on the case. Accepting that the legal route would get him nowhere, Castro decided to turn to a more drastic solution: armed revolution. Working in secret, Castro began recruiting like-minded followers, quietly, carefully, one trusted contact at a time. Within a year, he had assembled nearly 200, drawn almost entirely from the working and lower middle classes. Factory workers, students, clerks. They ranged from teenagers to people in their 40s, with an average age of 26, the same as Castro himself. Now, he had to try to turn them into an army. One volunteer pilfered Cuban army uniforms from a military hospital laundry. Another sourced surplus weapons and ammunition. All they could get were hunting rifles, shotguns, and a handful of pistols. But they set about training with them anyway, practicing their aim at firing ranges across the country, while posing as businessmen with an interest in hunting. Yet with the exception of a small inner circle, Castro's recruits still didn't know exactly what they were preparing for. They would soon find out. On the evening of July 25th, 1953, Castro gathered his small force at a farmhouse in Siboney, around 12 miles east of Santiago de Cuba, the island's second largest city. Many of the members had told their families that they were heading to the Santiago Carnival, which was currently in full swing. But rather than dancing in the streets, Castro had a different plan in mind: an assault on the Moncada barracks, the second largest military garrison in Cuba. It was home to over 1,000 soldiers and a vast arsenal of weapons. The plan was to drive in before dawn in their stolen uniforms, bluff their way through the gates, seize the arsenal, and use the barracks radio equipment to broadcast a message to the Cuban people, a call to rise up against Batista. At 4:45 a.m. on July 26th, a caravan of 16 cars rolled out of the Siboney farmhouse and headed toward Santiago de Cuba. Inside, Castro's insurgents sat in their stolen Cuban army uniforms, weapons hidden from view. The city was quiet. The carnival had finished. Castro knew the attack would not be easy. There would be 5 Cuban army soldiers for each one of his rebel fighters, but they had the element of surprise, and with soldiers likely exhausted from the night's festivities, Castro believed they could pull it off. However, somewhere in the streets of Santiago, the caravan began to fall apart. One car suffered a flat tire. 2 others took a wrong turn and became separated from the group. The vehicle carrying their heaviest weapons got lost entirely. By the time the lead cars approached the Moncada barracks, the force that was supposed to arrive as one had splintered into pieces. Nonetheless, the plan began well. The first car successfully bluffed its way through the gates at the barracks and disarmed the guards before they could react. But then everything fell apart. Precisely at that moment, a routine two-man patrol happened to be making its rounds just outside the gates. Realizing something was wrong, they quickly raised the alarm. By the time Castro's car, second in the convoy, reached the gates, soldiers were already pouring out of the barracks. Chaos erupted. The men in the cars behind Castro, unable to see what was happening ahead, assumed they'd already breached the perimeter. They leapt out of their vehicles and found themselves in the street outside the barracks, exposed, outnumbered, and under fire. A heavy machine gun opened up from a tower above. Castro's men, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, were pinned down in the street. The small group that had made it inside with the lead car fought on briefly before being overwhelmed. Castro ordered a retreat. It was all over in less than an hour. While only a handful of rebels lost their lives during the firefight, many were captured at the scene or intercepted in the following days as they tried to escape. One group attempted to hide in the nearby civilian hospital by posing as patients, but were soon discovered and thrown in jail. Several prisoners were tortured. A large number were executed without trial. In some cases, their bodies were arranged around the barracks afterward to make it appear they'd fallen in combat. Meanwhile, Castro himself fled into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra with a small group of survivors. For days they hid, exhausted and hunted. Then one morning, an army patrol found them sleeping. The patrol's commander, Lieutenant Pedro Soria, recognized the face of the man lying in the dirt before him. Rather than shooting him on the spot, Soria escorted Castro back to the civilian prison in Santiago, ensuring he would face a courtroom rather than a firing squad. It would turn out to be a decision that would change the course of history. Batista decided to put Castro and the other survivors on trial. Confident in his grip on power, he opened the courtroom to journalists and civilians, certain that a public humiliation of the young insurgents would send a clear message to anyone else considering armed resistance. It was, in hindsight, a catastrophic miscalculation. Imprisoned on the Isle of Pines, Castro had spent his time preparing not a defense, but an indictment of Batista, of corruption, of everything he believed had been stolen from the Cuban people. When he finally stood before the court in September 1953, he admitted everything. He had organized the attack. He would do it again. He was not a criminal, he argued. He was simply a Cuban citizen, doing his duty for the good of the country. The courtroom was transfixed, and Castro's message was now reaching a wider audience than ever. Alarmed by Castro's growing hold over the proceedings, the regime claimed he was too ill to continue and removed him from the main trial. But it was no use. Castro promptly got word out that he was in perfect health. The regime had attempted to silence him, and in doing so, had simply proved its oppressive nature. His sentencing was conducted in secret, 15 years in prison. But from his cell, Castro kept writing. He developed his courtroom speech into a full written document, a sweeping criticism of the Batista regime and a declaration of what Cuba could be. Page by page, it was secretly smuggled out of prison and into the hands of the Cuban people. The speech became known by its most famous line, quote, "History will absolve me." In the end, Castro served less than 2 years of his sentence. In 1955, bowing to mounting public pressure, Batista granted a general amnesty to political prisoners. Castro walked free. He left for Mexico almost immediately. There, with his brother Raul and a small group of loyalists, among them a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, he began planning the next stage. They called themselves the 26th of July movement, the date of the Moncada attack that had started it all. In December 1956, 82 rebels crammed onto a small yacht called the Granma and set sail for Cuba. The landing was a disaster. Met by Batista's forces almost immediately, the group was scattered and decimated. Only a handful survived to reach the Sierra Maestra mountains. It must have felt, in those desperate early days, very much like Moncada all over again. But Castro had learned from his earlier failure. From the mountains, his small band of survivors began to build. Slowly, patiently, guerrilla cell by guerrilla cell, until the movement had grown too large and too popular to be stopped. In March 1958, Washington, alarmed by Batista's brutality, imposed an arms embargo on the regime it had recognized just 6 years earlier. Batista's position collapsed rapidly. On January 1st, 1959, he fled Cuba as Castro's forces triumphantly entered Havana. The revolution, which had gotten off to such a shaky start at the Moncada barracks in 1953, had finally succeeded. But what did it actually promise? 3 days before the attack on the Moncada barracks, Castro had had a manifesto drawn up. It had provided the basis for his 1953 courtroom speech, the blueprint for a new Cuba. It was known as the Moncada Program. It called for land reform, access to education and health care for all Cubans, an end to corruption, free and fair elections, civil rights, social justice, and above all, Cuban sovereignty, a Cuba that belonged to its people, rather than to the powerful few, especially foreign powers. Yet what followed was more complicated. Cuba did see sweeping social reforms, literacy programs, universal health care, and land redistribution. But the democracy Castro had invoked at his trial never materialized. Political opponents were imprisoned. Dissent was suppressed. Tens of thousands of Cubans fled the island. The one-party state that replaced Batista's dictatorship worked on delivering the Moncada program's social promises while abandoning its democratic ones. In Washington, alarm grew quickly. As Castro nationalized American businesses, expelled U.S. diplomats, and moved closer to the Soviet Union, the relationship curdled into open hostility. Some historians argue it was never really about communism, that what Washington couldn't accept was simpler and older than that. The idea, first declared in a farmhouse outside Santiago in 1953, that Cuba might choose to put its own sovereignty before American interests. Whatever the root cause, the consequences were not long in coming. The CIA plotted against Castro, reportedly hundreds of times. In 1961, U.S.-backed Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs and were routed. A year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In 1962, President Kennedy imposed a full economic embargo on the island, which remains in place to this day. For the next 5 decades, the pattern rarely changed. Each American administration inherited the feud and passed it on unresolved. Meanwhile, Cuba lurched from crisis to crisis, most devastatingly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which stripped the island of its most powerful ally. Fidel Castro officially stepped down as leader in 2008 due to ill health, handing the reins to his brother Raul, generally considered more pragmatic. Tensions with the U.S. seemed to cool off somewhat, particularly during the Obama administration. Diplomatic relations were cautiously restored. Embassies reopened. The two nations seemed, slowly and carefully, to be feeling their way towards something different. On November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro passed away at the age of 90. Yet anyone hoping that the U.S.-Cuba conflict would die with its longest-standing protagonist would be in for a disappointment. 8 weeks later, Donald Trump became U.S. president and set about reversing many policies that had been designed to improve tensions. The subsequent Biden administration made few changes. In January 2026, the situation took a further turn for the worse when a U.S.-imposed fuel blockade cut off the island's primary energy supply. Hospitals rationed power. Surgeries were canceled. 11 million Cubans were plunged into darkness. Several weeks into the crisis, a young activist named Mirtia Broussard addressed a crowd of her compatriots on a Havana street corner, telling them, quote, "This is our Bay of Pigs. This is our Moncada." The argument that began at those army barracks over 70 years ago about what Cuba is, who it belongs to, and what role the United States gets to play remains as yet unsettled.